Walter Green was an elderly black man who gave up everything to care for two abandoned children he discovered in an alley. Years later, his ruthless employer set him up for a crime, and the courtroom turned against him. Whispers called him a thief, a liar, and a man undeserving of mercy. With his hands shackled and hope dwindling, the judge was ready to hand down a life sentence. But just as the gavel was about to strike, two figures stepped forward, revealing something that stunned everyone in the room. Before we continue, if this is your first time watching our videos, please consider subscribing. Your support means so much to us, and it allows us to bring more powerful stories to you. Stay with us until the end, and if this story touches you, share your thoughts in the comments and pass it along to a friend. Now let's get started. That winter was brutal, the kind that cut through old coats and worn shoes. The streets in small factory towns smelled of smoke and cold steel. A place where people hurried home with their heads down, ignoring those left behind. At the end of a long shift, Walter Green, a weary black man in his late 50s, limped along, a constant reminder of his years of factory labor. His boss often told him he was too slow, too worthless, and lucky to even have a job. But Walter never argued. He took the insults, endured his pain, and kept his head down. That evening, he passed a narrow alley behind a diner. The hum of freezer fans mixed with the howling wind. And there, tucked beside a dumpster, sat two children, pale and shivering, their clothes nothing more than rags barely covering their frail bodies. The boy's arm was wrapped around his little sister, trying to shield her from the cold. Walter stopped. He could have walked past, like everyone else, and his boss's words echoed in his mind. Don't waste time on strays. You can barely feed yourself. And he was right. Walter's meals were usually scraps, his room barely warm. But as he looked at the children, something stronger than hunger urged him to stop. He crouched down, his knees creaking, and the kids looked up with eyes that seemed older than their years. You two got anywhere to go? He asked gently. They didn't answer, just shook their heads. Walter exhaled, his breath fogging in the cold air. He knew what it felt like to be discarded, to be invisible, and he couldn't just leave them there. Not tonight, he said, extending a weathered hand. Come on. His voice was soft but firm. The boy hesitated, but the girl's tiny, ice-cold fingers slipped into his hand. That was enough. By the time they reached his modest apartment, neighbors peered through cracked doors. That fool, one muttered under her breath. Old man can't pay his own bills and now he's bringing home strays. Another laughed, shaking her head. He'll sink with them. Walter heard it all, as he always did, but he kept walking. Two fragile lives followed him into his apartment. It wasn't much. Peeling wallpaper, a sagging couch, and a rattling heater that barely gave off any warmth. But still, he spread blankets over the couch, warmed some broth, and watched as the children ate as if they hadn't seen food in days. That night, as he sat in the corner, rubbing his sore leg, Walter thought about how the next day his boss would mock him again. How money would stretch thinner than ever. But he also knew one thing. Those kids wouldn't be sleeping on the frozen pavement again. Not while he was alive. And in that quiet moment, a bond was forged. One that would have consequences he never expected. The days that followed weren't easy. Walter worked at a steel factory where the air smelled of burning iron. And the noise of clanging machinery rattled his bones. His boss, Mr. Harlan, was a man who thrived on humiliation. He would wait for the factory to go silent before shouting across the room. Green. Even those orphans you dragged home probably move faster than you. The workers laughed, some uncomfortably, others eagerly joining in. Walter never retaliated. He wiped the sweat from his brow and kept working, but every insult, every glare added weight to his burdens. At night, however, that weight seemed to lift. When Walter opened his apartment door, the children would run to him. Eli, the boy, always had a book in his hand, eager to read aloud what he'd learned in school. Grace, his little sister, would often sit at the wobbly table, drawing pictures of houses that looked warmer and brighter than anything they'd ever known. Walter shared his food when the cupboards ran bare, patched up Eli's jacket with awkward stitches, and saved whatever coins he could for Grace's shoes. Some nights, when the heater sputtered and died, he huddled them close, pretending he wasn't cold himself. The neighbors continued to gossip. Whispers spread, and they said things like, He'll end up on the street with them. One woman muttered as Walter passed. Another man sneered. A black man raising 2 white kids? They'll turn on him the first chance they get. Walter heard it all, but he never responded. Instead, he poured his energy into the children. He taught Eli how to change a tire, how to shake a hand with dignity. He taught Grace how to balance coins, how to stand firm, even when the world tried to diminish her. Yet Harlan never allowed Walter to forget his place. One time, when Walter asked for a day off to take Grace to the clinic, Harlan scoffed, saying, "You're not their father. Stop playing the hero and get back to work." But Walter went anyway. He took the day off, risking his pay. He walked Grace to the clinic, his hand firmly clasped around hers, fully aware of the consequences. That evening, when Harlan slashed his wages in half, Walter tucked the pay slip into his pocket, pretending nothing had changed. This routine continued for years, sacrifice after sacrifice. The children grew. Eli, sharp-eyed and even sharper in intellect, earned scholarships that Harlan claimed he didn't deserve. Grace, once a quiet girl with pencils, became a fierce debater, unafraid to challenge anyone who mocked her unusual family. Walter watched all this with silent pride. His limb grew heavier, his back more hunched with each passing year. But the kids stood taller. For the first time, Walter let himself believe that perhaps kindness wasn't wasted. Maybe it was planting something that would grow beyond him. What he didn't realize, though, was how closely Harlan had been watching and how bitter he'd become, seeing Walter build a family from nothing. By the time Eli and Grace went off to college, Walter's body carried decades of hard work. His hands were rough like stone, his back bent, his steps slower than ever. But his heart swelled with pride every time a letter arrived. Eli studying law, Grace pursuing journalism. He pinned their letters to the peeling wall like treasures. Harlan, however, hadn't softened. If anything, his spite had sharpened. He despised seeing Walter walk with his head a little higher, hated hearing people whisper about the orphans who were making something of themselves. To Harlan, it was proof that Walter had stolen a dignity he didn't deserve. Then one autumn morning, the trap was set. Walter came home to find 2 policemen waiting at his door, their uniforms crisp and their faces cold. A neighbor, watching from her window, muttered, "I told you so. I always knew he'd end up in trouble." The officers pushed past Walter, tearing through his small apartment. From under the couch cushion, they retrieved a small bag filled with cash and company equipment stamped with factory labels. Walter's breath caught. He had never seen these items before. Within hours, he was handcuffed, the metal biting into his wrists. Harlan stood outside the factory gates, arms crossed, smirking as Walter was led away. "Guess kindness doesn't pay after all," he sneered loud enough for the workers to hear. Some laughed, while others just turned away. The courtroom smelled of dust and varnish. Walter sat hunched, his once strong shoulders sagging. Prosecutors painted him as a bitter old man who had stolen to survive. The witnesses were workers Harlan had secretly paid off, claiming they had seen Walter sneaking around the storage rooms. Bystanders filled the benches, whispering, "I knew he was too good to be true. Those kids he raised don't even know who he really is." Walter said little. He wanted to scream, but years of swallowing insults had trained him to remain silent. He thought of Eli and Grace, but didn't want to drag them into this disgrace. It was better if they stayed away, never seeing him like this. When the judge's gavel struck, announcing that Walter could face a life sentence, the room seemed to close in on him. The walls pressed tight, and the air felt suffocating. Walter's eyes dropped to the floor, his heart heavy with a final truth. Maybe Harlan was right. Maybe a man like him was never meant to rise above his station. Then, the doors at the back of the courtroom creaked open. 2 figures stepped inside, confident and unshaken, their eyes fixed on the man sitting alone at the defendant's table. It was Eli and Grace, no longer the children he once carried home shivering, but adults now, shaped by the sacrifices he thought had gone unnoticed. The room buzzed with murmurs. Harlan's smirk faltered for the first time. Walter's chest tightened. He hadn't wanted them there, but as Eli laid down a stack of legal files and Grace lifted a recorder, scanning the faces in the gallery, he realized something he'd never allowed himself to believe. His kindness had come full circle, and the battle wasn't over yet. The courtroom buzzed now, as Eli straightened his tie and stepped forward. Gone was the timid boy who once hid in alleys. He stood tall, his voice steady as he introduced himself as Walter's defense attorney. Papers were slammed onto the table, thick with evidence. Grace took her place in the gallery, recorder flashing red. She wasn't there just to watch. She was documenting everything. Her articles had already shaken powerful names, and now her pen was aimed directly at Harlan. The prosecution tried to maintain their momentum, but Eli sliced through their case, piece by piece. Witnesses who had claimed to see Walter Steele faltered under his questioning. One admitted he'd only heard rumors, while another contradicted his own testimony when pressed. Eli exposed their lies, like a surgeon revealing wounds. Then came the bombshell. Grace stood up, requesting to share a report. It outlined Harlan's history of wage theft, harassment, and falsified accounts at the factory, supported by documents she had uncovered as a journalist. The room erupted into murmurs. Harlan's face turned red, his fists clenched. Walter sat frozen, blinking against the sting in his eyes. He had believed that the children he saved had moved on, outgrown him, and entered brighter worlds. But here they were, fighting with the fire he had unknowingly passed on to them. The judge leaned back, tapping his pen, weighing the storm unraveling before him. "It seems," he finally said, his voice echoing, "that this entire case was built on manipulation." He looked at Walter, then at Harlan. "The charges are dismissed." There were gasps. Applause. A few jeers aimed at Harlan as he stormed out. Defeated, Eli placed a hand on Walter's shoulder. Grace moved beside him, whispering, "You don't have to carry it alone anymore, Dad." That single word, Dad, echoed louder than the gavel that had set him free. Neighbors who had once mocked him fell silent. Reporters scribbled frantically, and Walter, old and weary, finally allowed his back to straighten and his eyes to meet the world. He had once lifted 2 children from the cold, and 20 years later, they had lifted him out of a cage. Because kindness doesn't die. It waits. It grows. And when the time is right, it saves. Walter never imagined that his act of kindness decades ago would one day save his life. This story reminds us that every act of compassion plants a seed that may return when we need it most. For more powerful stories of justice, sacrifice, and redemption, don't forget to subscribe and click on the next video. You won't want to miss what happens there.